You didn't leave because you stopped believing in God. You left because you got tired of performing for people who said they loved you. You left because you gave your best years to a place that didn't notice when you were drowning. You left because someone in a position of authority used that authority on you instead of for you. You left because the version of faith you were handed out turned out to be a costume, and you got tired of wearing it. Or maybe you didn't leave. Maybe you're still sitting in a pew every Sunday, singing every song, serving on every team, and you are more alone than you have ever been in your life. If that hits you, then this episode is for you. Welcome to Faith Formed. I'm your host, Justin, and this is the podcast about honest faith for people who don't have it all together. And I'm excited to be here with you for episode 31. And we're starting something new today. A three-part conversation about what I believe is one of the most honest questions that a believer can ask. And it's also one that I wrestle with. I mean, this is an honest space, right? I wrestle with this question, and I'm sure that many of you who are going to listen to this episode at some point in time, or even now, you have also struggled with this same question. And here it is. Where do I fit? Where do I fit? Anybody ever prayed that before? God, where do I fit? Not where do I attend? Not where do I serve? Not what do I believe? But where do I actually belong? Which is an incredibly huge question. It is so integral to the life and the health of a believer. I'm surprised that not more people actually ask it. But before we can go anywhere with that question, I need to start where most conversations like this one kind of refuse to start. We can gloss over this part of it, but I think before we can ask the question of where do I belong and where do I fit, I think we actually need to start with the wound. Because if I skip the wound and go right to the solutions, then I've done what we've done way too many times in churches. We've rushed your pain to get to my point. And we're not doing that. I'm not trying to make your healing a vehicle for this message. We're not doing that here, not today, not ever. Here on Faith Formed, your pain has a place. And I don't know, I'm honored when people choose to send emails and to share their stories with me. We want to properly steward that, and this is a place for that. Remember, honest faith for people who don't have it all together. That's what this podcast is about, as well as us being transformed into the image of Christ faithfully, scripturally. And so I need to start here, okay? And I know that this is a hot button issue. And you're going to hear me make this statement and you're going to say, well, duh, Justin. But I'm going to make it anyway because I need to honor it. And here it is. Church hurt is real. And I need to say that plainly and without qualification because for a long time, the church's default response to people who were hurting was to question whether the hurt was even legitimate. To say things like, well, the church is made of imperfect people, or you need to forgive and move on, or don't let the enemy use this to pull you away from our community. And I mean, look, some of this counsel is true, but I don't think any of it should be the place where we start when someone comes to us who is bleeding on the floor, on the pews, right? And so when you say the church is made up of imperfect people, yes. But when you say it to someone who has just had their trust shattered by a pastor or a parishioner, because this isn't just a pastor issue, right? But when we do that, what we're communicating is that their pain is a theological inconvenience for us. That the correct response to being wounded is to manage it quickly, quietly, and without making anybody uncomfortable on your way out of the door. And that's not Christian care, much less pastoral care. That is really, it's It's institutional self-protection that is dressed in a spiritual language. And I want to say clearly that it is that pattern that has cost the church more people than anything else. Not just their attendance, their trust, not just their tithes, their willingness to try again, and sometimes even their faith. Man, on social media, you see person after person who are against the church, even some who are against Christ, because of what's happened in churches that they have tried to attend, where accountability has not been made, where proper stewardship of the hearts of people in those communities has not been a priority, or if it's been a priority, it's not been a priority to the point where we're willing to take accountability or accept what we've done wrong in those situations. So let me name some categories, because church hurt is not just one thing. It comes in many different forms, and it leaves a lot of different marks. So there's the hurt of abuse. And I think this is one of the ones that we hear about most of all. It's leadership that controlled, manipulated, or exploited the people it was supposed to protect. It is spiritual authority that has been weaponized. It's accountability structures that existed to protect the leader and to silence the ones that they harmed. And again, this is not a small category. It's not an edge case. And if this is your story, I want you to hear me as clearly as I can say it. What happened to you was not God, and it was not faith. It was not church in any meaningful sense of the word. What happened was a person or a system that borrowed the language of the sacred to do something profane. Theologian Scot McKnight wrote a book called A Church Called Tov. And in it, he makes a distinction that I think every believer needs to understand. And I found this in my research for this episode. He argues that there are churches that cultivate goodness, what he calls tov, or the Hebrew word for good. And there are churches that cultivate power. And his observation is devastating in its simplicity. When an institution begins protecting itself over protecting the people inside it, the culture is already turned. The statement of faith doesn't matter. The worship experience doesn't matter. The brand doesn't matter. Because when the system exists to preserve the system, then the people inside of it are already in danger. Now just think about that. When the system exists to protect the system, the people within the system are sacrificed on the altar of protecting the system. That's what he's saying in an extent. Now, just think about that. Systems protecting systems instead of systems protecting people. And if that's where you were, I don't want to rush past that. I want to sit here with that for a minute. And I lean in, because I'm leaning in right now. I want you to lean in with me for just a second, because if that's you, I need to affirm that you were not weak for trusting. You were not naive for believing. You were doing what God designed you to do, which is giving yourselves over to a community. And unfortunately, someone in that community used that against you. And so your wound is real, and it deserves real care, not a quick theological pivot, not a discussion that makes you question whether what happened actually happened. No, you're a person, and you deserve real care, because that is what God designed us to do, but that is also what God designed us to receive. And then there's also the hurt of performance culture. And this is, churches where you looked like on a Sunday mattered more than who you were becoming the rest of the week. Where the pressure to appear fine was greater than the permission to be honest. Where vulnerability was preached from the pulpit and punished in the pews. Have you been there? And Paul confronted this exact thing in Galatians 2. He describes a scene where Peter, who was one of Jesus's homeboys, one of his closest disciples, the dude who had walked on water, who stood at the transfiguration, was eating with Gentile believers. And he was doing it freely. I mean, it was sweet, right? Until certain people from Jerusalem arrived, and then Peter wanted to flip the script. And because the moment they walked through the door, Peter pulled back and separated himself. He changed his posture based on his audience. And Paul called that out as hypocrisy. He said Peter was not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. Peter was playing a role to pander to those that he held in higher esteem than the people that he was with. And I want you to notice that Peter didn't change his theology. He changed his behavior based on who was watching. That's performance. And Paul did not let it stand. Not because he wanted to embarrass Peter. No. There is a form of confrontation and challenge that is God-centered, that is God-honoring, and also seeks to honor the person being challenged and corrected. And that's what Paul is demonstrating here, right? He wasn't trying to embarrass Peter, but he was trying to show him the harm that performance has on a community, because it teaches people that authenticity is conditional and that you can only be fully yourself when the right people aren't watching. And if you sit in a church like that long enough, you know what it does to you. You stop bringing your real questions because real questions make people uncomfortable. You stop naming your real struggles because struggle equals weakness and weakness isn't welcome. You show up and perform the role and drive home, still carrying everything that you walked in with. And eventually, if you're honest, you forget who you actually are because you've been performing so long that role, it feels like your truthful face when you look into the mirror. Then there's the hurt of exclusion. The sense that there was an inside and you were also out and you were outside of it. That the community was real, but it just wasn't for you. That you were welcomed as a number, but never pursued as a person. That you could serve in the building for years and still feel like a stranger. And man, I know the pain of this very well. Because this one is quieter than the others. It doesn't leave obvious marks, but it does its damage because exclusion doesn't just make you feel unwanted in a particular place. Over time, it makes you question whether you are the kind of person who belongs anywhere. It hurts to feel excluded in the place where God is inviting you to be included, to be a part of community. And I think, man, this is probably going to get me in trouble. But I think we are quick to say that the message of inclusion, the message of nobody walks alone has to be preached from the pulpit. And yes, it does. But if you were sitting in a pew, that message is just as much yours to preach and to act out in your behavior as it is anybody who comes from a stage. Because if I go to your church, even if the pastor is not preaching about nobody walks alone here, everybody is welcome. But if I'm standing in your foyer, if I'm standing in your hallway, your atrium, whatever, and everybody is clicked up and nobody is looking for me as the new person, then yeah, everybody's getting a side eye and I'm not coming back. And you may come back at me and say, nope, it's your job. It's your job, brother, to make yourself known. It's your job to join the small groups. It's your job to go to the Wednesday nights. It's your job. Okay, I'm not going to fight against that, but here's what I'm going to say. Why aren't we in churches looking for the people that we've not seen before? Why are we so quick to run toward the people that we're comfortable with and circle up and talk about the lunch we're about to go have or the games our children are involved in and all of this? why aren't we not looking for the people who have never been there before that we might not ever see again? Two things can be true. Yes. But when we begin to prioritize our systems, our discipleship groups, our small groups, our Wednesday night Bible studies over just making it a point, y'all, look for people that you don't know. Because if we say that nobody walks alone, but there are people who are sitting in our churches who feel like nobody sees them, who feels like nobody cares about them, that is not simply a problem from the stage. That is a problem equally in the pews. I'm sorry, I'm saying it with my whole chest. I had a pastor once who told us, don't let me see you after church in a circle with people who were members here, who are involved in ministry here, who are serving here. They're not the people who need your after-church conversation. They're not the people who need your after-church hugs. It's the people that you have never seen before, that may have only been here once or twice, who are trying to decide if this is a place where they want to plant, if they feel comfortable enough to be honest and transparent with us. But we're missing them. We're missing them. And I need to get off my soapbox. Recenter, Justin. Recenter. Okay. There is also the hurt of burnout, where you've served faithfully. You showed up consistently. You gave your time, your gifts, your energy. You gave your money. You led the small groups and served in children's ministry, and you helped set up chairs. You gave because you believed in what you were building. And somewhere along the way, gradually, then all at once, you realized that the institution needed more of you than it was giving back. That the relationship was extractive, and that your gifts were being used, but you were not being known. And when you finally step back, because there's always a moment where we step back, and you say, I need to slow down, I'm running on empty, then nobody calls you. People don't really speak to you like they used to on a Sunday morning when y'all were serving together. And that silence was its own kind of answer about how you were valued in that space. And then there's the hurt of unmet expectations, which is maybe the most complicated one of all, because we all have different expectations, right? Because sometimes the church didn't fail you dramatically. It just disappointed you quietly, consistently for months or years at a time. It's not a scandal. It's not abuse. And it's not even a moment where you can point to and say, this is when it happened. It's just like a slow erosion, an accumulating weight of small disappointments, a growing gap between what you believed the church was supposed to be and what you experienced it to be, until the disappointment becomes distance, and the distance became a door that you walked out of, and now you're on the other side of it, not entirely sure what you lost or whether you're allowed to miss it. Again, every one of these wounds is legitimate, and I'm not going to rank them or qualify them, and I'm not going to move past them quickly either, though. I want to sit with them, with you, in this. Because some of you have never had anyone do that. You walked away and people let you. They didn't ask you to stay. They just let you. Or you stayed and people didn't notice. And in both cases, the message was the same. Your pain was not worth slowing down for. Well, on this podcast, we slow down. And I need to say something that goes beyond naming individual wounds. Because I think that if we're honest, if we're really honest, what happened to a lot of people wasn't just the failure of a pastor or the dysfunction of a congregation. It was the failure of a model. Because we've built a version of church that was optimized for attendance and for giving, but not necessarily for formation. Not necessarily for becoming, for addition and not depth, for programs that scale, not relationships that can sustain us. We measured success by how many people showed up on Sunday morning and how much money came in through the offering that can help us with our building fund so that we can reach more people for Christ. And we've celebrated growth and we've called it health. And in the process, slowly, without most people noticing, I think we've turned the body of Christ into a production. And again, I'm not talking about every church. I'm not talking about every body of believers. But I feel comfortable in saying what I'm saying right now because I've seen enough of it or enough of the results of it to know that this is true. We gave people an experience instead of a community. We gave them a stage instead of an altar. We gave them content instead of covenant. And then we were surprised when people said that they felt alone. They felt alone because they were alone. The model never required anyone to actually know them. You could attend for years, consume the teaching, enjoy the worship, love the word, drop your kids off in a clean facility, and never once be asked the question, how are you actually doing? Or be asked it in someone who's actually interested in what you have to say. And never once actually feel safe enough to answer it honestly. And I'm not saying this to condemn anybody. That's not my job. Because I've been in that world. I've been a staff pastor. I've been in the world, y'all. I know how hard these people work. I know how much of their lives are given over to the mission. I know about all the meetings and all of the hard conversations and all of the sleepless nights and all of the nerves and the anxiety. I know how much of these people genuinely love the people that they're serving. So I'm not attacking anybody. I'm not condemning anybody. But love without structure produces good intentions and bad outcomes. And the structure that we built, for all of its efficiency, all of its reach, all of its polished excellence, was not built for the kind of soul formation that Jesus had in mind when he said, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. That's John 13:35. Not if you produce excellent content, not if everything's polished, not if you have great kids programs, not if your worship team is tight and the harmonies are on point, even though I love me an on point harmony. But it's if you love one another. And that's not a scalable kind of love. The kind of love that Jesus is talking about here, it is slow. It's inconvenient, right? It's messy. It can be chaotic because it requires you to be known and to know. And a lot of what we built in the name of church was designed, whether intentionally or not, to make that kind of love unnecessary. People didn't just get hurt in church. They got hurt by a vision of church that was never going to be able to hold them. And naming that is not cynicism. At least I don't believe that it is. If you believe that it is, let's talk about it. I think the first step toward building something better is about being honest about why what we had wasn't enough in the first place. And here's what I want you to notice. The pain you're carrying, the confusion, the grief, the sense of betrayal, it's not new and it's not unique to this generation. And it is not outside the awareness of God. I mean, the Psalms are full of it. Psalms 55 is one of the most raw texts, in my opinion, in the entire Bible. Most people know the Psalms as songs of praise, like Psalm 23, Psalms 100, Psalms 150. But the Psalter contains a whole category of prayers that theologians call the Psalms of Lament. We've talked about a few of them. And they are brutally, uncomfortably honest about what it feels like when faith collides with pain. Psalms 55 is one of those. David writes this: if an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship, at the house of God. See, David isn't describing a wound from a stranger. Go back and read that slowly again. He is describing the specific, particular agony of someone being hurt by someone he worshiped beside, someone he prayed with, someone who sat with him in the house of God and shared the sacred space. And then that person became the source of the wound. David doesn't handle this with theological composure either. Earlier in the psalm, he says, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me." See, that's not a man who has processed his feelings and arrived at a healthy resolution. Y'all, that's a man in the middle of it. Brother is shaken and overwhelmed. And God put it in the Bible. He didn't hide it from us. And it's not to inspire us, and it's not to give us a template for recovery, but to tell us that this is known. This kind of wound has always existed, and you're allowed to feel the full weight of it before you decide what you want to do with it. We talk about Walter Brueggemann a lot on this podcast because, in my opinion, he's one of the most important Old Testament scholars of the last century. And he argues that the Psalms of Lament are not failures of faith. Sit with that for a minute. Your lament does not discredit your faith. It's an expression of it. He says that lament is the voice of faith that takes its own experience seriously enough to speak to God about it. I think that sentence reorders everything. See, most of us were taught, either explicitly or implicitly, that mature faith moves on past pain quickly. That lingering in grief equals weak faith. That the spiritually healthy thing to do is name what happened, forgive, and move forward. But I think what Brueggemann is saying here is that bringing your anguish to God, not trying to clean it up and make it PC, not softening it, but bringing it to God raw, is itself an act of trust. You only cry out to someone you believe is listening. And what I'm inviting you to do in this episode is not to resolve the wound, but it's to name it honestly and to bring it to the one who already knows it. If you were to look in my journal, so I tend to write down, some of my most honest prayers. And if you were to look in my journal as recently as, the other morning, you might see all caps where I'm yelling at God. You might see scribbles where my thoughts are so confused and, not delineated that all I can just write is scribbles on paper. Because what I'm asking you to just name it honestly and bring it to God. Because God's not petty. He's not going to strike you with lightning because you're honest with him about what you're feeling. Yes, he knows it. But him knowing it and you trusting him enough to come to him and say exactly what it is, to name that thing, that's an incredibly different kind of faith. And see, David ends Psalms 55 not with a resolution, but with a resolve. He says, "But as for me, I trust in you." He doesn't say the pain is gone. He doesn't say the person who hurt him was restored. But he says, despite all of this, God, I still trust you in the middle of this. And I think it's that tension of honest grief held alongside sustained faith is the posture that over these next few weeks we're working toward. But I also want to go one layer deeper. Because underneath church hurt, there is something that rarely gets named directly, and that's loneliness. Not just loneliness that comes after leaving, but the loneliness that was already there. The loneliness that made the wound so devastating when it came. I think I've talked about this before in an earlier episode, but former U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, called an epidemic of loneliness in 2023. He even released an advisory about it. And he talked about how loneliness carries health risks comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We are the most digitally connected generation, but among the most relationally isolated. We have followers. We don't have witnesses. We have audiences. We don't have community. And the church was supposed to be there to be the answer for that. The church was supposed to be the one institution in human society where the rules of performance and image and comparison didn't apply. Where you could walk in broken and be received. Where your weakness was not a liability but an invitation. Which makes it so much more devastating when the church becomes the source of the loneliness instead of the cure. Henri Nouwen, we talk about him almost every weekend. He wrote in The Wounded Healer, "The Christian community is not the place where we escape from our wounds, but the place where we bring them." See, most of us walked into church hoping it would be a place of escape. I come in late. I leave early. Hopefully nobody sees me, even though I really need somebody to see me. And I think one of the things that we were hoping for when we were trying to plant Pursuit Church is that it could be a place where nobody could hide. And looking back on that, maybe, that was too much of an attack on the modern ethos. Because people want to hide. People want to escape. We want to hide from our failures and our fears and our unanswered questions. We don't necessarily want to be seen, but we just want some place where we can put down the weight and then leave before we pick it back up again. And I think when the church, when the church turned out to be just as complicated, just as political, just as exhausting as everywhere else, when it added to the weight instead of subtracting from it, we felt not just disappointed, but also deceived. But what Nouwen is saying is that we had the wrong expectation from the beginning. The church was never supposed to be an escape from the wounds. Rather, it was supposed to be a place where wounds could be brought into the open and received with grace. Because the tragedy is not that so many churches failed to be that. The tragedy is that most people who walked through the doors never experienced it. And so they don't know what they're looking for when they say they want to try again. They know what they're trying to escape from. They just don't know yet what they're trying to find. And that's part of what this whole arc is about. Building a language for what you actually need. So that when you step back toward community, you're not just hoping it won't hurt you again. You're looking for something specific. You can name it. Something that the New Testament church actually describes. And we'll get there. But not today. Today we stay in the wound a little bit longer. Because I want to make a distinction now. Because how we name the wound determines how we heal from it. There's a difference between being hurt by people and being disillusioned by an institution. Both are real. And both deserve honest attention, honestly. But they require different kinds of work. See, when people hurt you, the work is relational and deeply personal. It requires grief because you lost something that you trusted. It involves forgiveness, not as a quick transaction, but as a long process. And not because the person who hurt you deserves it, but because your soul needs it. And it may involve real, lasting, appropriate distance from those specific people. Forgiveness doesn't require restoration of access. Again, forgiveness does not require you to hand someone back the proximity that they used to harm you. But when an institution harms you, the work is theological. And that's where most of this deconstruction that we're seeing is coming from. because it requires separating the imperfect structure from the perfect Christ that structure was meant to point all of us toward. It requires asking hard questions, not just about what went wrong, but about what the church was ever supposed to be in the first place. And here's why this distinction matters. A lot of people living in spiritual isolation right now never made it. They were hurt by a person and concluded that the whole institution was broken. Or they were disappointed by a structure, and somewhere in the pain they began to blame God. And I understand how it happens. Trust me, I do. When something is sacred, when you've woven your faith in your community and your sense of belonging all together in the same place, you don't have clean categories for the damage because it all bleeds over. Therefore, because it all bleeds over, it all collapses at once. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about this. He wrote a book called Life Together. And it was a book that was born out of his experience living in a genuine Christian culture with his seminary students during the rise of the Nazi regime. And he wrote, "He who loves his dream of community more than the Christian community itself becomes a destroyer of the latter, even though his personal intentions may be ever so earnest and honest." When I saw this, it took me off guard. I had to read it a few times to get it, but as best as I can reason, here's what he was saying. All right. He's pointing to the danger of the idea of the idealized church. Like the version that we build up in our heads and in our imagination before the real people show up and complicated it. He's saying that when we love our dream of community more than the actual community, then we become a hazard to it. Because real community, the kind that forms you, that holds you accountable, that kind of community costs us something. And we will always fall short of the dream. And if the dream is what you're protecting, and you build systems around protecting that dream, then you'll declare every real community a failure. And I want to be careful here, okay? I'm not saying every wound is just a failure of expectation management. Some institutions are genuinely toxic. They're genuinely toxic. Some structures need to be called out, but discernment is required. If you blamed God for what a pastor did, that wound needs naming, not a theological position. Because if you do that, that's a transfer of pain. And if you walked away from every form of community because one community failed you, hold on, let me stop. And if you walked away from every form of community because one community failed you, I need to ask you, is that healing or is that hiding? Because there is a difference. And for most of us, if we're quiet long enough to hear ourselves, we know which one it is. And for most of us, it's hiding. And I think I want to press on this because I think that it's the most important question in this entire episode. And most teachers glide past it. And I don't want to do that because isolation feels like safety. And I'm saying this as someone who currently feels isolation really, really strongly. But when you've been hurt in community, being alone feels not just comfortable, but responsible. You're protecting yourself and you're giving yourself space to heal. And I get that. And you're not going to let that happen again. I get that. And for a season, a real defined grace-covered seasoned withdrawal will actually allow God to heal you. And there's biblical precedence for that. Withdrawal is sometimes the mercy of God. But here's what I need you to see. The mercy of God was not the destination. It was a provision for the journey back. Back to what, Justin? Back toward the community. It was never God's intention for you to be by yourself for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years. It was God's intention that he provide you a season of merciful withdrawal so that you could go back to the community. Right? Right. And I'm telling you all of this because I think that it is, you ran. God let you rest. He fed you. He didn't rebuke you for needing the space. But now the question is, what are you doing here? Like God asks Elijah, what are you doing here? And he's not asking it in conviction, but he's asking it in invitation. Because here's the truth. Long-term isolation doesn't heal the wound. It preserves it. You keep feeling it. It keeps the wound in a sealed environment where nothing can touch it. Not infection, but also not healing. You stay in a controlled space where you manage all of the variables, where no one can get close enough to you. Because you hold all the cards. You hold all the power in every relationship because in effect, you make yourself untouchable and then have the gall to call it healing. But what it actually is, and I say this with as much pastoral care as I can right now, y'all know I have the heart of a pastor. I have a heart to smell like the sheep, and I need to say this to you honestly. You call it healing, but actually what it is a slow surrender of the very capacity for community that the wound didn't kill. The wound didn't destroy your ability to belong. That's what I'm saying. But years of isolation can. Brené Brown. I know she's a hot button topic for a lot of folks, but on this, just stick with me. She says this. Connection is why we are here. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. And she goes on to describe the pain of disconnection as one of the most damaging experiences a human can ignore. I mean, can endure. I'm sorry. And she argues, and I believe this is consistent with Scripture, that the only way through disconnection is not more distance. It is the risk of vulnerable re-entry. And Bonhoeffer says this with a more theological slant. He says, Christianity means community through Jesus Christ and in Jesus Christ. No Christian community is more or less than this. A faith practiced alone, it may still be faith, but it's a diminished faith. It is a faith that is closed off the very channels through which much of God's formation work flows. The wounds you carry don't disqualify you from the community. They make you necessary for that community. And I'm not telling you to go back to what hurt you. I'm telling you that the permanent absence of community is not the answer your soul is looking for, even when every part of you insists that it is. And the journey back is real. It's slow. It requires discernment and boundaries and probably some help from someone trained to walk people through this kind of reentry. Therapy. We need therapy. But the journey is possible and it's worth taking. And we're going to talk about more of what that looks like in episode 33, I believe. But first, next episode, we have to understand what we're actually looking for, because most people went back to church looking for a community, and what they actually needed was belonging. And those two things are not the same. Listen, I planted a church. I want you to know that before I say anything else in this section, because I'm not speaking about church hurt from the safety of a comfortable position. I'm not some detached observer. After more of a decade of waiting and preparing, praying and believing. We tried to plant a church that lasted 6 months. And so I know what it is to pour yourself into something that just doesn't work out. I know what it is to pour yourself into something that you believed God was pointing you toward, and it didn't work out the way that you would. I know the grief of standing in a gap between the vision and the outcome. I know what it's like to have to decide in that gap what you actually believe about God. I know what it is to write in a journal, God, I just don't trust you anymore with this. I actually wrote that in my journal. And I also know the pull toward isolation, the pull toward hiding yourself, the voice that rises up after something like that and says, you tried, you gave, you believe, and look what happened. Now your job is to stay in, to stay small, to stay safe, and don't do it again. That voice is persuasive. It sounds like wisdom, but it's self-preservation. And it uses your pain as its evidence. But what I want to tell you and what I actively have to tell myself, that voice is not the voice of faith. It's the voice of a wound that hasn't finished healing yet. And if you let it make decisions for you, it will take you away into some place that God never intended for you to stay. I haven't given up on community. I haven't given up on the church or on what the church is designed by God to be. But I actively ask myself, Justin, where do you fit? Where do you belong? And what I've had to give up is my specific vision for how a church we attend looks like, or the church that we eventually try to plant again will look like. I don't know. And that surrender is its own kind of faith. And it always starts with naming the wound correctly. Not dramatizing it, not minimizing it, but naming it. Bringing it to God, and then slowly, with honesty and discernment, finding the courage to try again. And so that's where we land after episode 1. I know that this one was long, but there was a lot that I needed to unpack. The wound is real. David named his wound in Psalms 55 and didn't clean it. Elijah collapsed under his wound in the wilderness, and God met him there. Can I encourage you to name your wound correctly, to grieve it honestly, but don't let the wound become your worldview. Don't let what happened in one place become your verdict in every place. And don't let the pain of community drive you into an extended season of isolation. Because isolation will cost you things the wound never intended to take. In next episode, we go deeper. We talk about the difference between community and belonging. But before we get there, I want you to ask yourself, what am I actually carrying? Is it the hurt of a specific person, disillusionment with an institution, a grief I've been calling something else? And then ask the harder question, am I healing or am I hiding? You don't have to have the answer today. You just have to be honest enough to ask. Let me pray with you before you go. Father, I'm coming to you on behalf of every person who just listened to this episode. And I want to be specific because you're specific. And the people carrying these wounds deserve more than just a generic prayer. For the one who was abused by someone in authority, God, I ask you to separate what was done to them from who you are. They need to know that those two are not the same. Heal the confusion that God created between the name of Jesus and the behavior of people who claim to represent him. You are not them. You have never been them. For the person who performed for years and finally walked away exhausted, Abba, would you remind them that who they were before the mask? Remind them of that. Remind them that they have never needed their performance, that you've never needed them to perform, that you called them, not their version of themselves. Let the rest they have found outside of the building become a genuine rest and rooted in you. For the one who served and was never seen, Father, you see them. You've always seen them. The work they did in your name was not wasted just because people around them didn't notice it. You noticed. And the record that matters is yours. For the one sitting in isolation right now, calling it peace, God, do what you did for Elijah. Let them rest, feed them, and then, in your time, ask them the question. What are you doing here? Not in judgment, but an invitation. What are you doing here? And help them to have the courage to answer honestly. And for the one who was not sure if they believe any of this anymore, the one who came into this episode skeptical or hopeful or somewhere in between, Father, meet them exactly where they are. You are not put off by their doubt. You are not diminished by their distance. You are the same God who pursued the prodigal before he could form the words to come home. Pursue them. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, and before you go, I need a minute. If this episode met you somewhere real today, if something landed, if something you've been carrying finally had a name, if you found yourself thinking about someone who needs to hear this, please don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode. Send it to someone who's been carrying a church hurt alone and doesn't know how to talk about it. Post it on your socials. Text it. Put it in front of someone who needs to know they're not the only one. If Faith Formed has been adding value to your faith journey, if this podcast has been a thing that you listen to when you're driving or walking or trying to figure out what you actually believe, I want to ask you to do something that takes less than 60 seconds. Leave a rating and a review wherever you listen to podcasts. That's one small action from you, but it's big for how this show is discovered by people who are searching for this exact kind of conversation. Every review you leave is potentially someone finding their way to something that helps them. Subscribe if you haven't. We're one episode into, a 3-part arc, and the next 2 go deeper. I don't want you to miss them. So don't miss them. This has been Faith Formed, episode 31. I'm your host, Justin. Just a brother walking through you with honest faith. I'll see you next week. Be blessed.